The grand hall of the International Music Conservatory was buzzing with a quiet energy that only true music lovers could understand. It was the first day of the world's most prestigious piano competition, and the air was thick with anticipation. In the center of it all, moving with a confidence that bordered on arrogance, was a young man named Alexander. He was, by all accounts, a prodigy. At just 28 years old, he had already achieved what most pianists could only dream of. He had played with renowned orchestras in Vienna, New York, and Tokyo. His name was on the lips of every classical music critic, and his fingers were said to be gifts from the heavens themselves. He had been playing since he was 3 years old, not because he was forced to, but because the piano seemed to call to him, a natural extension of his very being. Alexander carried himself with an air of someone who knew victory was not just a possibility, but a certainty. His suit was tailored perfectly, his dark hair was styled just so, and his eyes held a glint of cold fire. He wasn't here to compete. He was here to collect what he believed was rightfully his. The first prize, the acclaim, the standing ovations, they were all just formalities in his mind. He had spent years perfecting his craft, practicing for 6, sometimes 8 hours a day, sacrificing a normal childhood and young adulthood for the love of ivory keys. He knew every note, every crescendo, every delicate touch required for the pieces he would perform. His chosen masterpiece for the competition was Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 3, a piece so notoriously difficult that it was often called the Rach 3, a monster that only the most skilled dared to tame. For Alexander, it was just another Tuesday, as he sat in the front row of the audience, waiting for his turn to perform in the preliminary rounds. He didn't watch the other contestants with a sense of camaraderie or shared passion. Instead, he watched like a hawk, dissecting their every move. He would lean over to his manager, a sharp-suited man named Richard, and whisper his critiques. "Too much rubato in the left hand. She's losing the rhythm," he'd say, about a young woman from Japan. "His phrasing is all wrong. He's treating the Chopin like it's a military march." He'd comment on a performer from Germany. There was no malice in his voice, just a cold, detached analysis. To him, these weren't fellow artists. They were obstacles, each one a stepping stone on his path to the winner's circle. The morning passed in a blur of what Alexander considered mediocre performances. Some were technically proficient but lacked soul. Others had passion but were sloppy in their execution. He found himself growing impatient, his fingers twitching in his lap, eager to show the judges and the audience what real piano playing sounded like. He closed his eyes, mentally running through the first movement of the Rach 3, imagining the roar of the crowd, the flash of cameras, the weight of the gold medal in his hand. He was so lost in his own world of impending glory that he barely registered the next name being called over the speaker system. Contestant number 47, Alina Kovacs, will be performing Chopin's Below No. 1. Alexander didn't even look up. He just sighed quietly and checked his phone for messages from his agent. Another name? Another hopeful? Another disappointment, he thought. He expected another nervous student, another amateur who had somehow managed to qualify. But then something made him lift his head. It wasn't the name or the piece, but the sound of footsteps on the stage. They were slow, deliberate, and lacked the hurried, anxious energy of the previous contestants. A woman walked to the center of the stage and sat at the gleaming black Steinway. She was not what Alexander expected. She wasn't young and glamorous, nor was she old and frail. She looked to be in her mid-40s, with simple, unstyled hair pulled back from her face. She wore a plain, dark blue dress that was elegant but not flashy. There were no diamonds around her neck, no fancy shoes. She looked like someone's mother, like a school teacher, like someone who belonged in a cozy living room, not on a grand stage in front of a panel of the world's toughest judges. She adjusted the bench, ran her hands over her lap, and took a deep breath. For a moment, she just sat there, her eyes closed, as if gathering strength from somewhere deep within. Alexander was about to look back down at his phone, completely uninterested. But then, she placed her fingers on the keys, and the first notes filled the hall. It wasn't a loud, dramatic opening. It was quiet, almost hesitant, like a question being asked in the dark. A simple melancholic melody began to unfold. It was Chopin, yes, but it was a Chopin that Alexander had never heard before. It was slower than most interpretations, more thoughtful. Every note seemed to be chosen with immense care, not just for its sound, but for its meaning. The woman, Alina, played with a focus that was absolute. Her eyes were closed, her body swaying slightly with the music. She wasn't just playing the piano. She was living inside the music. Alexander found himself putting his phone down. His curiosity piqued. He watched her hands. They weren't the hands of a typical virtuoso. They were not overly long or slender, and they moved with a quiet efficiency rather than flashy speed. But there was a strength in them, a control that was undeniable. As the piece progressed, the music began to grow more complex, more passionate. The quiet questioning of the opening gave way to waves of emotion, sorrow, longing, moments of fleeting joy, and then a deep, abiding sadness. The hall, which had been filled with the rustling of programs and the occasional cough, fell into a profound silence. Everyone was captivated. Alexander, the prodigy. The man who was supposed to win this competition without breaking a sweat, felt a strange sensation in his chest. It was a feeling he couldn't immediately identify. It wasn't annoyance or jealousy. It was something else. It was a pull. The music coming from the piano was not technically perfect. He could spot a few minor errors, a slightly missed note here, a pedaling that was a bit too cloudy there. But none of it mattered. The technical flaws were completely overshadowed by a raw, powerful, emotional honesty that he had rarely encountered. This woman wasn't just playing the notes on the page. She was telling a story. Her story? A story of love, of loss, of a life lived fully. With all its pain and beauty, he leaned forward in his seat, his eyes fixed on the woman on stage. He saw the subtle lines around her eyes, the way her brow furrowed in concentration during the most difficult passages. He saw a flicker of something in her expression. A memory, perhaps. A ghost of a smile or a shadow of a tear. He realized that this performance wasn't for the judges, or for the audience, or for the prize. It was for her. It was as if she had poured a lifetime of unspoken feelings into those 88 keys. And now, in this moment, they were all spilling out into the world. The music swelled to a powerful, dramatic climax, and then just as suddenly, it quieted down again, returning to the sad, simple melody of the beginning. The final notes hung in the air, delicate and fragile, before fading into complete silence. The silence that followed was different from the one before. It was heavier, thicker, filled with the echoes of the story that had just been told. No one moved. No one clapped. It was as if the entire audience was holding its breath, afraid to break the spell. Alina kept her eyes closed for a long moment after the last note had vanished. Then, slowly, she opened them and looked out at the silent hall. A faint blush rose to her cheeks, as if she was surprised to find so many people watching her. She gave a small, almost shy nod to the judges, and then to the audience, before rising from the bench and walking off the stage with the same quiet, deliberate steps she had entered with. The silence was finally broken by a single person clapping in the back row. Then another and another. Soon, the entire hall erupted in applause. It wasn't the polite, respectful applause that most contestants received. It was a deep, heartfelt roar of appreciation. People were on their feet, their faces filled with emotion. Alexander remained seated, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. He wasn't clapping. He was too stunned, too shaken by what he had just experienced. He looked over at his manager, Richard, who was also on his feet, clapping enthusiastically.
Well, that was
unexpected, Richard said, his eyes wide with surprise. She's got some real passion, doesn't she? Alexander didn't answer. He just stared at the empty stage, his mind racing. For the first time in a very long time, he felt a flicker of doubt. Not in his own ability, but in his understanding of what music was supposed to be. He had always believed that music was about precision, about technical perfection, about conquering the most difficult pieces and performing them flawlessly. He saw the piano as a mountain to be climbed, a challenge to be overcome. But the woman Alina had treated the piano like an old friend, a confidant. She hadn't conquered the Chopin. She had conversed with it. She had shared a piece of her soul with it. As the applause finally died down and the next contestant was announced, Alexander leaned back in his seat, a thoughtful frown on his face. He was still the favorite. He was still the prodigy. He was still the one everyone expected to win. But the game had changed. He was no longer just competing against other musicians. He was competing against an idea, a different way of seeing the world of music. He looked at his own hands, the hands that could play faster and more accurately than almost anyone else's. And for the first time, he wondered if that was enough. The woman had played, and in doing so, she had changed everything. The next few days passed in a strange sort of blur for Alexander. He went through the motions of the competition, of course. He performed his piece in the second preliminary round with the same cold technical brilliance that had become his trademark. The judges nodded, the critics scribbled in their notebooks, and the audience gave him a polite, respectful applause. It was all so predictable, so easy, but his heart wasn't in it. His mind kept drifting back to the woman, Elena. He found himself watching the list of performers each day, looking for her name. He wanted to see her play again, to understand what it was about her music that had unsettled him so deeply. He learned more about her from the competition program and from the whispers of the other contestants. She was a music teacher from a small town in Hungary. She had never competed internationally before. In fact, she hadn't performed for a large audience in over 20 years. She had studied at the same conservatory as him, but while he had been fast-tracked into a solo career, she had returned to her hometown to care for her aging parents and to teach music to children. She had spent her 20s and 30s not in grand concert halls, but in small classrooms. Her days filled with the off-key tunes of beginners and the simple joy of a child. Finally mastering a scale, Alexander couldn't wrap his head around it. Why would someone with her talent waste it on teaching children? Why would she hide away for so many years, only to emerge now in the most prestigious competition in the world? It made no sense to him. His entire life had been a relentless pursuit of perfection, a climb to the top of the musical mountain. He had sacrificed everything for his art. He had given up friendships, parties, and the simple pleasures of a normal life. He had dedicated himself to the piano with a monk-like discipline. And yet this woman, who had seemingly lived a normal, ordinary life, could create a kind of music that he, with all his training and dedication, could only dream of. The day of the semifinals arrived. The tension in the conservatory was palpable. The field of contestants had been narrowed down to just 12, and the atmosphere was thick with nerves and ambition. Alexander, of course, was not nervous. He was confident, as always. But there was a new feeling mixed in with his confidence, a feeling of anticipation. He was scheduled to perform in the afternoon session. Elena was scheduled for the morning. He decided to go to the hall early to watch her. He told himself it was a strategic move, that he needed to size up his most serious competition. But deep down, he knew it was more than that. He was drawn to her music, to the mystery of it. He found a seat in the back row, hoping to remain unnoticed. When Elena walked onto the stage, she looked even more unassuming than she had during the preliminaries. She wore the same simple dark dress, and her hair was still pulled back in a no-nonsense style. She didn't acknowledge the audience or the judges. She just walked to the piano, sat down, and took a deep breath. She seemed to be gathering herself, pulling her energy inward, away from the expectations of the crowd. She began to play. The piece was Bach's French Suite No. 5. It was a piece of music that Alexander knew intimately, a piece he had played countless times. It was a technical challenge, a test of a pianist's precision and control. He had always played it with a crisp, clean, almost mathematical accuracy. But Elena's interpretation was completely different. It was slower, more lyrical. She lingered on certain notes, letting them ring out with a warmth and tenderness that Alexander had never considered possible. She wasn't just playing a series of notes. She was weaving a tapestry of sound, each thread a different color, different emotion. As he listened, Alexander found himself transported. He wasn't in a competition hall anymore. He was in a small, sun-drenched room, watching a young girl dance. He was in a quiet church, listening to a choir sing. He was walking through a forest on a crisp autumn day. The music was painting pictures in his mind, evoking memories he didn't know he had. He saw his own mother, humming a lullaby as she tucked him into bed. He saw his first piano teacher, a kind, elderly woman with a gentle smile. He saw a younger version of himself, a boy who loved the piano, not for the applause or the accolades, but for the simple joy of making a beautiful sound. A wave of nostalgia washed over him, so powerful it almost took his breath away. He had spent so many years building walls around his heart, convincing himself that emotion was a weakness, that true art was about control and precision. But Elena's music was tearing those walls down, brick by brick. It was reminding him of a part of himself he had long forgotten, part of him that he had suppressed in his relentless pursuit of perfection. He watched her hands as they moved across the keys. They were not the hands of a virtuoso, but they were the hands of a storyteller. Every gesture, every touch of a key was filled with meaning. She was not just playing the music, she was living it. She was sharing a piece of her soul with the audience, and in doing so, she was touching theirs. When she finished, the hall was silent for a moment, and then the applause began. It was the same kind of heartfelt, emotional applause that she had received in the preliminaries. People were on their feet, their faces filled with a mixture of awe and gratitude. Elena seemed a little overwhelmed by the response. She gave a small, shy smile and a quick nod before hurrying off the stage. Alexander remained in his seat. Long after the applause had died down and the next contestant had begun to play, he was lost in thought, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. He felt a grudging respect for Elena, a sense of wonder at her talent. But he also felt a strange sense of loss, a longing for something he couldn't quite name. He was a man who had everything he had ever wanted, fame, fortune, and the respect of his peers. But for the first time in his life, he felt like he was missing something essential. Later that afternoon, it was his turn to perform. He walked onto the stage with his usual confident stride, but his mind was elsewhere. He sat at the piano and placed his fingers on the keys, ready to begin his piece. Liszt's Hungarian Rhapsody No. 2. It was a piece that was perfectly suited to his style, a piece that allowed him to showcase his dazzling technique and his virtuosic flair. He began to play. The notes flew from his fingers with breathtaking speed and accuracy. The music was loud, dramatic, and full of fire. It was a performance that was designed to impress, to awe, to dominate. He played with a power and a precision that was undeniable. The audience was captivated, their eyes wide with amazement. When he finished, they erupted in a thunderous ovation. It was the kind of applause he was used to, the kind of applause that fed his ego and confirmed his status as a musical genius. He took his bows, a triumphant smile on his face. But as he walked off the stage, the smile felt hollow. The applause sounded empty. He had played the notes perfectly, but he had left his heart behind. He had performed like a machine, not like a human being. He had conquered the list, but he had not connected with it. He had not shared a piece of his soul with the audience. He had just shown off his skills. Backstage, he saw Elena standing by herself, quietly warming up her hands for the next round. He hesitated for a moment, then walked over to her. He didn't know what he was going to say, but he felt a strange need to talk to her, to bridge the gap between their two different worlds. "Your technique is remarkable," she said, before he could even speak. Her voice was soft and gentle with a slight accent. "You play with such power." Alexander was taken aback. He had expected her to be intimidated by him, to be resentful of his success. But she was just being kind, just being a fellow musician. "Thank you," he said, his voice a little stiff. He felt a surge of his old arrogance, a need to assert his superiority. "You play with feeling," he said, the word feeling tasting strange in his mouth. "But competitions require precision." Elena smiled gently. There was no hint of offense in her eyes, only a quiet understanding. "Music isn't about precision alone," she said. "It's about connecting with something beyond ourselves. It's about telling a story, about sharing a piece of our hearts with the world." Alexander didn't know how to respond to that. He had always seen music as a competition, a battle to be won. He had never thought of it as a way to connect with something beyond himself. He had never thought of it as a way to share his heart. "I see," he said, though he didn't. Not really. Alina gave him another one of her gentle smiles. "You have a great gift," she said. "Don't be afraid to use it to connect with people, not just to impress them." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Alexander standing alone, his mind reeling. Her words echoed in his head, a quiet challenge to everything he had ever believed about music and about himself. He looked down at his hands, the hands that could play faster and more accurately than almost anyone else's. And for the first time, he wondered if they were also capable of something more, something deeper, something that he had been missing all along. Asterisk. The days leading up to the final round were a strange and unsettling time for Alexander. He had always been a man of routine, a creature of habit. His life was a carefully constructed schedule of practice, performance, and rest. But now his routine was broken. He still practiced, of course, but his sessions were different. They were no longer just about technical perfection, about mastering the most difficult passages. He found himself lingering on certain notes, trying to find the emotion within them, trying to tell a story with his music, just as Alina had suggested. But it was a struggle. It felt unnatural, like trying to write with his non-dominant hand. He had spent so many years building walls around his heart, and now he was trying to tear them down. It was a painful and confusing process. He found himself thinking about Alina constantly. He wondered about her life in that small town in Hungary. He imagined her teaching a group of children, her face lit up with a gentle smile. He pictured her playing the piano in her quiet living room, not for an audience, but for herself, for the sheer joy of it. He felt a strange sense of envy, a longing for a life that was simpler, more connected to the things that truly mattered. He had always looked down on people who lived ordinary lives, but now he saw a beauty in it, a richness that his own life of fame and fortune lacked. He tried to talk to his manager, Richard, about his feelings, but Richard didn't understand. "You're just getting nervous," Richard said, clapping him on the back. "It's normal before a big competition. Just focus on your technique, on what you do best. You'll be fine. You're going to win this thing. I know it." But Alexander wasn't so sure anymore. Winning didn't seem as important as it once did. He wanted to play well, of course, but he wanted more than that. He wanted to connect with the music, to connect with the audience, to feel something real. He wanted to play not just with his hands, but with his heart. The night before the final round, he couldn't sleep. He tossed and turned, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. He got out of bed and walked over to the window, looking out at the city lights. He felt a profound sense of loneliness, a feeling that he had never allowed himself to acknowledge before. He was surrounded by people, by fans, by admirers, but he was utterly alone. He had built a wall around himself, and now he was trapped inside it. He thought about Elena's words, about connecting with something beyond himself. He didn't know what she meant, but he wanted to find out. He wanted to break free from the prison of his own ego, to experience music in a new and deeper way. The next morning, he woke up feeling a strange sense of calm. He was still nervous, of course, but it was a different kind of nervousness. It was the nervousness of an explorer about to embark on a journey into the unknown, not the nervousness of a gladiator about to enter the arena. He went to the conservatory, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and excitement. The final round was structured differently from the previous rounds. Instead of each contestant performing separately, they would all be on stage at the same time, waiting their turn to play. It was a high-pressure situation, a test of not only musical skill, but also mental fortitude. Alexander was the first to arrive. He took his seat on the stage, his eyes scanning the empty hall. He watched as the other contestants began to file in, their faces a mixture of determination and anxiety. He saw a young man from Russia, his jaw set with a fierce ambition. He saw a young woman from China, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched her sheet music. He saw a middle-aged man from Italy, his face a mask of stoic concentration. They were all his rivals, his competitors. But for the first time, he didn't see them as obstacles. He saw them as fellow musicians, as fellow human beings, each with their own hopes and fears, their own stories to tell. Then Alina arrived. She moved with her usual quiet grace, her eyes downcast, as if she was trying to make herself as small as possible. She took her seat a few chairs away from Alexander, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She didn't look at him, but he could feel her presence, a quiet strength that seemed to calm his own nerves. The judges took their seats, and the audience began to file in. The hall was soon filled to capacity, the air buzzing with anticipation. Alexander looked out at the sea of faces, his heart pounding in his chest. He had played for thousands of people before, but this felt different. This felt more personal, more intimate. The first contestant was called. It was the young man from Russia. He strode to the piano with a confident air and launched into a fiery, passionate performance of a piece by Prokofiev. It was a dazzling display of technical virtuosity. The audience responded with an enthusiastic applause. Then it was Elena's turn. She walked to the piano, her steps slow and deliberate. She sat down, and for a moment she just looked at the keys, as if gathering her thoughts. Then she began to play. The piece was Schubert's Impromptu in G-flat major. It was a simple, unassuming piece, a piece that was often overlooked by more ambitious pianists. But in Elena's hands, it became something magical. She played with a tenderness and a sensitivity that was breathtaking. Every note was a pearl, every phrase a poem. She wasn't just playing the music, she was singing it, her fingers dancing across the keys with a lightness and a grace that seemed to defy gravity. Alexander was completely captivated. He forgot about the competition, about the judges, about the audience. He was lost in the world of Elena's music. He saw a young girl running through a field of wildflowers, a mother singing a lullaby to her child, an old man reminiscing about his youth. The music was a stream of memories, a river of emotions, and he was floating along with it, carried away by its gentle current. When she finished, the hall was silent for a long moment, and then the applause began. It was a soft, respectful applause at first. Then it grew louder and louder until it was a thunderous roar. People were on their feet, their faces filled with tears. Alina seemed surprised by the reaction, a faint blush rising to her cheeks. She gave a small, shy smile and a quick nod before returning to her seat. Alexander looked at her, a newfound admiration in his eyes. He saw her not as a rival, but as a teacher, a guide who was showing him a new way to see the world of music. He wanted to thank her, to tell her how much her music meant to him, but he didn't know how. He was a man of few words, and his pride still held him back. Then it was his turn. He walked to the piano, his legs feeling a little unsteady. He sat down and looked out at the audience. He saw their expectant faces, their eyes shining with anticipation. He took a deep breath and began to play. The piece was Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata. It was a piece he had played 100 times before, a piece he knew like the back of his hand. But this time, it was different. He didn't play it with his usual cold, technical precision. He played it with a newfound vulnerability, a willingness to open his heart and let the music flow through him. He thought about Elena's words, about connecting with something beyond himself. He thought about the little boy who loved the piano for the simple joy of making a beautiful sound. He thought about his mother, his first piano teacher, all the people who had helped him along the way. He played the first movement with a tenderness and a sadness that he had never felt before. The notes were no longer just notes. They were feelings, memories, dreams. He was telling his own story, a story of a lonely boy who found solace in music. A story of a man who had lost his way and was trying to find his way back. The audience was silent, completely captivated by his performance. They could feel the emotion in his music, the raw, unfiltered honesty of it. They were not just listening to a great pianist. They were listening to a human being bearing his soul. When he finished, the hall was silent for a long moment, and then the applause began. It was not the polite, respectful applause he was used to. It was a deep, heartfelt roar of appreciation. People were on their feet, their faces filled with a mixture of awe and emotion. Alexander was taken aback by the response. He had never felt such a connection with an audience before. He had never felt so seen, so understood. He took his bows, his heart pounding with a joy that he had never felt before. He looked over at Alina and saw that she was on her feet, clapping enthusiastically, a genuine smile on her face. He felt a surge of gratitude towards her, a sense of a debt that could never be repaid. As he walked back to his seat, he felt a sense of peace settle over him. He didn't know if he would win the competition. It didn't really matter anymore. He had already won a much more important victory. He had found his way back to the music, back to himself. He had learned that true art was not about perfection, but about connection. It was not about conquering the music, but about letting the music conquer you. And in that moment, he knew that his life would never be the same again. The atmosphere in the grand hall was electric, a palpable tension that prickled the skin. The final round had whittled the competition down to just 2. It was a scenario that no one, not the critics, not the organizers, and certainly not Alexander himself, had predicted. There, on opposite sides of the stage, sat the 2 finalists. One was Alexander, the prodigy, the anointed one, the man who had come here expecting to collect his prize. The other was Alina, the quiet music teacher, from a small Hungarian town. The woman who had stumbled into the competition, and in doing so, had stumbled into everyone's hearts. The contrast between them was stark, a living embodiment of 2 different philosophies of music, of 2 different ways of living a life. Alexander felt a strange sense of calm. The anxiety that had been his constant companion for years had subsided, replaced by a quiet acceptance. He looked over at Alina. She was sitting perfectly still, her hands resting in her lap, her eyes closed. She seemed to be in a state of meditation, completely detached from the noise and the nervous energy of the hall. She wasn't thinking about winning or losing. She was just preparing to make music. Alexander felt a deep sense of respect for her. She had taught him more in a few days than he had learned in a lifetime of study. The rules for the final round were simple. Each pianist would perform 1 piece of their own choosing. The order had been decided by a draw of lots, and Alexander was to go first. He walked to the center of the stage, the spotlights feeling warmer than usual, the roar of the crowd a distant hum. He had chosen a piece that was a testament to his old self, a piece that was the pinnacle of technical difficulty. Liszt's Hungarian Rhapsody No. 2. It was a piece he had played 1,000 times. A piece that was his warhorse, his guaranteed showstopper. He sat at the Steinway, his fingers hovering over the keys. For a fleeting moment, he considered changing his piece, playing something simpler, something more in line with the new feelings he was exploring. But then he thought better of it. This was who he was. He was a virtuoso, a master of the instrument. He didn't need to hide from that. He just needed to find a way to infuse that technical mastery with the soul. He had rediscovered. He took a deep breath and began to play. The opening notes were a storm, a whirlwind of sound that filled every corner of the hall. His fingers flew across the keys with a speed and a precision that was breathtaking. It was a display of pure, unadulterated technical power, the kind of playing that had made him famous. The audience was on the edge of their seats, their eyes wide with amazement. They had never seen anything like it. But as the piece progressed, something began to shift. The music was still dazzling, still technically flawless, but it was no longer just a display of skill. It was a conversation. Alexander was no longer just conquering the piano. He was collaborating with it. He was finding the emotion hidden within the complex runs and the thundering chords. He was telling a story, not just about a Hungarian folk hero, but about his own journey. The stormy passages were his years of arrogant isolation. The moments of quiet beauty were his newfound humility. The triumphant finale was his acceptance of both the light and the dark within himself. When he played the final, cascading notes, the hall erupted. It was a deafening roar, a tidal wave of sound that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. People were on their feet, their faces flushed with excitement. They were not just applauding his technique. They were applauding his heart. He had managed to bridge the gap between his 2 selves, the cold perfectionist and the vulnerable artist. He had played with both his head and his heart. And the result was a performance that was truly transcendent. He took his bows, his face beaming with a genuine joy that he hadn't felt in years. He looked over at Alina and saw that she was on her feet, clapping enthusiastically, a warm, genuine smile on her face. There was no envy in her eyes, only a shared appreciation for the beauty of the music. He felt a connection to her in that moment, a bond that went beyond competition. As he walked back to his seat, he felt a sense of peace. He had done his best. He had played with honesty and with passion. Whether he won or lost didn't really matter. He had already won his own personal battle. He had found his way back to the music. Then it was Elena's turn. She walked to the piano with her usual quiet grace, her simple dark dress, a stark contrast to Alexander's tailored suit. She didn't acknowledge the applause. She just sat down, adjusted the bench, and placed her fingers on the keys. The hall fell silent, a hushed anticipation hanging in the air. She began to play. The piece was Debussy's Clair de Lune. It was a piece that was familiar to almost everyone. A piece that was often played by students and amateurs. It was not a piece that was typically chosen for a high-stakes competition. It was too simple, too subtle, too intimate. But as Elena's fingers coaxed the first notes from the piano, the audience knew they were in for something special. Her interpretation was unlike anything Alexander had ever heard. It was slower, more spacious than most. She lingered on certain notes, letting them hang in the air like shimmering pearls. She used the pedal with a masterful touch, creating a wash of sound that was both ethereal and deeply moving. It was as if she was not just playing the notes on the page, but painting a picture with sound. A picture of a moonlit night, a sky full of stars, a world of quiet contemplation and profound beauty. Alexander watched, completely mesmerized. He saw the music through Elena's eyes. He saw a young woman looking out her window, dreaming of a life she could not have. He saw a mother rocking her child to sleep, her heart filled with a love that was too big for words. He saw an old woman sitting on a park bench, her face etched with the lines of a life well lived, a life of joy and sorrow, of love and loss. The music was not just a performance, it was a prayer. It was a conversation with the divine. It was a sharing of a soul so pure and so deep that it seemed to transcend the limitations of the human experience. The hall was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. The audience was not just listening. They were meditating, they were praying, they were being transported to a higher plane of existence. When Alina played the final, fading notes, the silence that followed was profound. It was a sacred silence, a moment of shared reverence. No one wanted to be the first to break the spell. Then, a single person in the back row began to clap, slowly, reverently, then another and another. Soon the entire hall was filled with a thunderous applause. An applause that was not just for a brilliant performance, but for a life-changing experience. Alina seemed surprised by the intensity of the reaction. She gave a small, shy bow, her cheeks flushed with a modest blush. She was not a performer who thrived on applause. She was a musician who thrived on connection, and in that moment, she had connected with everyone in the hall on the deepest possible level. Alexander watched her, his heart filled with a sense of awe and wonder. He knew with a certainty that was both humbling and liberating that he had just lost the competition, and he was okay with that. He had witnessed something that went beyond winning or losing. He had witnessed the true power of music. The judges retreated to their room to deliberate. The wait felt like an eternity. Alexander and Alina sat on opposite sides of the stage, not speaking, but sharing a silent understanding. They had both given their all. They had both bared their souls, and in doing so, they had both won. Finally, the head judge, a stern-looking man with a reputation for being a tough critic, returned to the stage. He walked to the microphone, the silence in the hall so thick it was almost suffocating. "The judges have reached a decision," he said, his voice grave and serious. "This was one of the most difficult decisions we have ever had to make. Both finalists gave performances of exceptional quality, performances that will be remembered for years to come." He paused, his eyes scanning the two finalists. "However, there can be only one winner. The winner of this year's international piano competition is Alina Kovacs." The hall erupted in a roar of applause. Alexander felt a shock wave of disbelief, followed by an unexpected wave of relief. It was over. The pressure was off. He had lost, but he felt like he had won something much more valuable. He had found his way back to the music, back to himself. He watched as Alina walked to the center of the stage to receive her award. She looked stunned, as if she couldn't quite believe what was happening. The head judge handed her a bouquet of flowers and a gleaming gold medal. She held them in her hands, her eyes filled with tears as she stood there. Basking in the applause, she caught Alexander's eye. She gave him a small, modest nod of acknowledgement, a gesture of shared respect and understanding. He nodded back, a genuine smile on his face. He was not a sore loser. He was a grateful student, and he had just received the greatest lesson of his life. The woman had played, and in doing so, she had changed everything. The roar of the crowd was a physical force, a wave of sound that washed over the stage. Confetti, shimmering and golden, rained down from the ceiling. In the center of it all stood Alina, clutching the heavy gold medal in her hand, as if it were a strange and unfamiliar object. Her face was a mixture of shock and a quiet, tearful joy. She had not expected this. She had not come here for this. For her, the real prize had been the music itself, the chance to share a piece of her soul on this grand stage. The rest was just noise. Alexander watched from his seat, a calm smile on his face. He felt no bitterness, no sting of defeat. Instead, he felt a profound sense of release. A lightness he hadn't felt since he was a boy first discovering the magic of the piano. The outcome felt right. As natural and inevitable as the changing of the seasons. The winner's gala was being held in an opulent ballroom down the street. Crystal chandeliers dripped light onto polished marble floors. Waiters in white jackets circulated with trays of champagne and delicate awe. D'oeuvres. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the self-congratulatory chatter of the classical music elite. His manager, Richard, was already at his side, a firm hand on his shoulder. "Don't worry about it, my boy," Richard said, his voice a low, confident rumble. "You played magnificently. Everyone knows it. The judges were just looking for a story, a sentimental favorite. You'll be back next year and you'll wipe the floor with them. We'll start planning the victory tour tomorrow." Alexander nodded absently, but his heart wasn't in it. The thought of a victory tour felt hollow, a replay of a life he no longer wanted to live. He saw Alina across the room, surrounded by a small group of well-wishers. She looked overwhelmed, like a wildflower that had been accidentally placed in a fancy vase. She was smiling politely, but her eyes kept darting towards the exit. A clear longing for the quiet comfort of her own world. He knew he couldn't stay. He couldn't go through the motions of this celebration, this performance of success. He had to get out. He excused himself from Richard, muttering something about needing some fresh air. He walked out of the ballroom, the stuffy air and artificial light giving way to the cool night. He stood on the pavement for a moment, watching the city's lights blur into a watercolor painting. He had no plan, no destination. He just started walking. The city was a different creature at night. The hurried, businesslike energy of the day had melted away, replaced by a slower, more contemplative rhythm. He walked past brightly lit restaurants and dark, quiet shops. He listened to the distant wail of a siren, the laughter of a group of friends spilling out of a bar, the lonely cry of a gull circling overhead. He was just another face in the crowd, another anonymous soul moving through the urban landscape. It was a feeling he hadn't experienced in a long time. It was strangely liberating. After about 20 minutes of walking, he found himself in a part of town he didn't recognize. The streets were narrower, the buildings older. The glow of the neon signs was softer, more artistic. He heard a sound that made him stop in his tracks. It was the sound of a piano, but not the kind he was used to. It wasn't the crisp, precise sound of a concert grand. It was a warmer, more intimate sound, a little ragged around the edges, full of character. It was coming from a small, unassuming club with a simple sign that read the Blue Note. A handwritten notice on the door read "Live Jazz Tonight." He hesitated for a moment, then pushed the door open and stepped inside. The club was small and dark, lit mainly by the soft glow of candles on the tables. The air was thick with the smell of old wood, polished brass, and the faint, sweet aroma of whiskey. A small stage was set up in the corner, occupied by a trio of musicians, a drummer, a bassist, and a pianist. They were playing a smoky, melancholic ballad, the music weaving a spell of lazy, late-night introspection. Alexander found a small table in the back and ordered a drink. He sat in the shadows, watching, listening. The pianist was not a virtuoso in the classical sense. His technique was loose, improvisational. He made mistakes, but he didn't seem to care. He was not trying to conquer the music. He was in conversation with it. He was playing with a joy, a freedom, a sense of play that Alexander had never experienced. He was not just playing the notes. He was telling a story, sharing a feeling, creating a mood. As the set went on, Alexander became more and more engrossed. He forgot about the competition, about his career, about everything. He was just a man listening to music. He felt a sense of connection with the musicians, with the other people in the club, with the music itself. It was the feeling he had been searching for, the feeling that Elena's music had hinted at. It was the feeling of being part of something bigger than himself. Then he saw her. Sitting at a table near the stage, a glass of wine in front of her, was Elena. She had changed out of her simple dress into a pair of jeans and a plain sweater. She looked more relaxed, more at home in this informal setting than she had in the grand concert hall. She was watching the pianist with a look of pure, unadulterated joy, her foot tapping in time with the music. When the set ended, she applauded enthusiastically, a genuine heartfelt smile on her face. The pianist caught her eye and gave her a small nod of recognition. Then, to Alexander's surprise, the bassist said something into the microphone. "And now, folks, we'd like to invite a very special guest to join us on stage. Please give a warm welcome to Elena." Elena blushed, but she didn't hesitate. She walked to the stage, sat down at the piano, and exchanged a few quiet words with the pianist. He got up and gave her the bench. The bassist and drummer looked at her, waiting for her cue. She placed her fingers on the keys and began to play. It was a standard jazz tune, one that Alexander didn't recognize. But her interpretation was immediately captivating. She didn't play with the flashy technique of a classically trained pianist. She played with a simple, heartfelt sincerity. Her lines were clear and melodic, her harmonies rich and expressive. She was not trying to show off. She was just having a conversation with the other musicians. A conversation that was full of wit, humor, and a deep, abiding love for the music. She was improvising, creating something new and spontaneous in the moment, completely unconcerned with technique or judgment. She was free, Alexander watched, completely mesmerized. He was seeing a side of her he had never seen before, a side that was playful, adventurous, and utterly fearless. This was not the quiet, nervous woman who had walked onto the competition stage. This was a musician in her element, a true artist, completely lost in the joy of creation. The music she made was not perfect, but it was alive. It was breathing. It was pulsing. It was real. When the set was over, the club erupted in applause. Elena gave a small, shy bow, and then returned to her table. Alexander waited a few moments, then gathered his courage and walked over to her. "That was incredible," he said, his voice a little hesitant. "I had no idea you played jazz." Elena looked up, a little surprised to see him. A small smile played on her lips. "It's my secret passion," she said. "It's where I go to just play. No pressure, no expectations. Just the music." "I understand," Alexander said, and he realized that he truly did. "I've been playing for others for so long," he admitted, the words coming out in a rush. A confession he hadn't known he was holding inside. For the judges, for the critics, for the audience. "I think I forgot why I started." Lena looked at him, her eyes full of a gentle, understanding compassion. She didn't offer any easy platitudes or empty words of comfort. She just listened. "The music was never meant to be in your fingers," she said softly, her voice a quiet melody in the noisy club. "It was meant to be in your heart." Her words struck him with the force of a revelation. It was so simple, so obvious, and yet it was the most profound thing anyone had ever said to him. He felt a lump form in his throat, a wave of emotion so powerful it almost brought him to his knees. He had spent his entire life trying to perfect his fingers, to make them faster, stronger, more accurate. He had never once thought about his heart. He didn't know what else to say. He just nodded, a silent acknowledgement of the truth she had shared with him. He thanked her, and then he turned and walked out of the club, back into the cool night air. In the months that followed, Alexander's life changed in ways that no one could have predicted. He did not go on a victory tour. He did not schedule a series of high-profile concerts. He did the opposite. He canceled his entire competition schedule. He fired his manager, Richard, who was baffled and furious by his decision. He locked himself away in his apartment, not with a stack of competition pieces, but with a collection of old recordings, of blues, of jazz, of folk music from around the world. He was not practicing. He was listening. He was relearning music, not as a conqueror, but as a lover. He was trying to find the music in his heart. He started to play again, but in a different way. He played for himself, for the sheer joy of it. He played simple melodies, improvising, experimenting, making mistakes, and learning from them. He was not trying to be perfect. He was just trying to be honest. He started to play in small, local clubs, just like the one where he had found Alina. He played for a few dollars and a free drink. For an audience of 10 or 15 people who were there for the music, not for the spectacle, he played with a newfound vulnerability, a willingness to share his true self with the world. His music was no longer just technically brilliant. It was also emotionally resonant, deeply human, and utterly captivating. He had found a new kind of success, a success that was not measured in trophies or applause, but in the connection he felt with the music and with the people who listened to it.